I lived in a haunted house for months, constantly haunted by strange occurrences and terrifying experiences. What I uncovered about its dark past and the chilling truth behind it will leave you in shock and disbelief. You know those ghost stories people tell around a campfire? Well, imagine living one. For months I heard strange noises in the middle of the night, saw things move on their own, and even felt something touch me when no one else was there. It wasn't until I finally uncovered the truth that I realized how horrifying the situation really was. This is the story of how I lived in a haunted house, and why I'll never trust my gut again. Part 1. The Move-In. So, it all started when I moved into this old house that I found online. It was one of those rental deals that seemed too good to be true. 3 bedrooms, big backyard, and a quiet neighborhood, all for way less than what you'd expect. My lease was about to expire at my tiny apartment, and I figured, why not upgrade? Sure, the house was old and kinda creepy, but I convinced myself it had character. The landlord was this older guy named Mr. Hargrove. He seemed nice enough, but kind of evasive. When I asked why the rent was so cheap, he said something vague like, "I just want someone to take care of the place." I shrugged it off, thinking he was just a typical retired guy who didn't want to deal with a lot of hassle. Moving day was uneventful, but I did notice something weird. The neighbors across the street were standing on their porch watching me the entire time. Not like a casual glance either. They straight up stared. I tried waving, but they didn't wave back. At the time, I chalked it up to small-town awkwardness. The house itself was, well, let's just say it had a vibe. The floors creaked even when I wasn't walking on them, and the wallpaper was peeling in spots, revealing this weird greenish plaster underneath. There was this massive old mirror in the hallway upstairs, and it gave me the creeps right away. But hey, I figured a few quirky details were normal in a house this old. The first night, though, was when things started to feel off. I was unpacking in the kitchen when I heard this faint thudding sound, like someone was walking upstairs. At first, I thought maybe the neighbors had a loud TV or something, but then I remembered the house wasn't attached to anything. It was completely standalone. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just the house settling. But then, as I was brushing my teeth before bed, I swear I heard whispering, like actual whispering, just outside the bathroom door. When I swung the door open, there was nothing there. That was night 1. Part 2. The Unexplainable begins. The next few days were mostly fine, but little things kept happening that I couldn't explain. For example, I'd leave a room and come back to find something moved. At first, I thought I was just being forgetful, like maybe I had left the remote on the coffee table, not the couch. Or maybe I hadn't closed that cabinet all the way. But then, one morning, I found a chair pulled out from the dining table, like someone had been sitting there. I know I didn't leave it like that. The weirdest part? Every time I'd find something out of place, I'd get this heavy feeling in my chest, like I was being watched. I started telling myself it was just paranoia from being in a new, unfamiliar house. But by the end of that week, I wasn't so sure. One night, I was sitting in the living room watching TV when I heard footsteps, clear, deliberate footsteps, coming from upstairs. My first thought was, okay, someone's broken in. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a broomstick, and went upstairs, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped the second I reached the top of the stairs. I checked every room. Nothing. The doors and windows were all locked. No sign of anyone. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, but my nerves were shot. Then, there was the thing with the mirror. Remember that old mirror in the hallway? Well, one night as I was walking past it, I swear I saw something move. Not me, something else. Like a shadow darting across the reflection. I stopped and stared at it for a good minute, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe I was overtired. But the longer I stared, the more uncomfortable I felt. It's hard to describe, but it was like the mirror was too still, like it was waiting for something. I ended up throwing a blanket over it that night. I know it sounds silly, but it made me feel better. At least temporarily. The next morning, I found the blanket crumpled on the floor. Part 3. The Strange Visitor. By this point, I was starting to think I'd made a huge mistake moving into this house. Every creak and shadow felt sinister, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Still, I hadn't told anyone about it, partly because I didn't want to sound crazy and partly because I was trying to convince myself it was nothing. That changed after I got a knock on the door one afternoon. It was one of the neighbors, the same ones who had been staring at me on moving day. She was this older woman, probably in her 60s, with sharp eyes and a kind of stiff, uneasy energy. She introduced herself as Mrs. Abrams and said she just wanted to check in. At first I thought she was being neighborly, but then she started asking weirdly specific questions. "How are you sleeping?" she asked, glancing over my shoulder into the house. Fine, I guess," I lied. "Have you noticed anything strange?" Her voice dropped, almost like she didn't want anyone else to hear her. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, she just gave me this tight smile and said, "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to come by." Then she handed me a piece of paper with her phone number scribbled on it and left. I stood there for a minute, trying to process what had just happened. Did she know something I didn't? That night, I decided to Google the house. Why I hadn't done this sooner, I don't know, but better late than never, right? What I found wasn't exactly comforting. The house had been sitting empty for years before I moved in. According to a local news article, the last family who lived there left suddenly after their teenage son went missing. He was never found. I wish I could say that was the worst thing I discovered, but no. There were multiple reports of people who had lived in the house claiming it was haunted. One woman even said she'd seen a shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed. I didn't sleep much that night. Part 4. The Night It Escalated. After my little Google rabbit hole, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in over my head. But I also didn't want to be that person who bails on a lease because of some creepy stories and weird noises. I told myself I was just psyching myself out, letting my imagination run wild. Then came the night that changed everything. It was around 2 a.m., and I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone because sleep had become a distant memory at this point. The house was dead quiet, and I was starting to feel like maybe, just maybe, things were calming down, and then I heard it. A loud, deliberate bang from the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart jumped into my throat. I sat up, straining to listen, hoping it was just the wind or maybe the old pipes acting up. But no, it happened again. Another bang, closer this time. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, my hands shaking so bad I almost dropped it. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept toward the door. "Hello?" I called out, even though I knew no one would answer. The hallway was empty, but just as I was about to turn back, I felt something. It started as a faint pressure, like the air around me was getting thicker. Then, out of nowhere, it felt like someone brushed past me, cold and fast. I froze, my whole body locking up, as goosebumps rippled down my arms. That's when I heard the whisper. It was low and raspy, like it was coming from inside my own head. "Get out!" I didn't think. I just bolted back into my room, slammed the door, and locked it. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I sat there for what felt like hours, clutching my phone and staring at the door, waiting for I don't even know what, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I called my best friend Hannah and told her everything. At first, she laughed and said I was being dramatic, but when I told her about the whisper, her tone changed. "You need to get someone to check that place out," she said. "Like a priest or a paranormal investigator or something?" I laughed it off. But deep down, I was starting to think she was right. Part 5. A Visit from the Paranormal Investigator. After that night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was seriously wrong with the house. I wasn't ready to call a priest or move out just yet, but I needed answers. So, I took Hannah's advice and reached out to a local paranormal investigator. His name was Mark, and he looked exactly like you'd expect. Mid-30s, black hoodie, a bunch of crystal necklaces, and this intense vibe like he'd seen some things. When he showed up, he had a duffel bag full of gear. EMF detectors, a thermal camera, and even some sage. The first thing he said when he walked in was, "Whoa, yeah, the energy here is heavy." I didn't know what that meant, but it wasn't exactly reassuring. We started in the living room, where Mark set up his equipment and asked me a bunch of questions. Had I ever used a Ouija board? Nope. Had I noticed cold spots? All the time. Had I heard voices? Too many to count. As we went through the house, Mark explained what he was doing. The EMF detector would light up if there was an energy presence, and the thermal camera could pick up unusual cold spots or shapes. When we got to the hallway with the creepy mirror, the EMF detector went nuts. It was beeping and flashing like crazy. "This is definitely a hot spot," Mark said, frowning. I told him about the shadow I'd seen in the mirror and how I'd thrown a blanket over it. He nodded like that made perfect sense and said, "Mirrors can act as portals. They reflect energy, and sometimes they hold on to it." Portals. Energy? I had no idea what he was talking about, but I wasn't about to argue. Then came the thermal camera. As Mark scanned the hallway, he suddenly stopped and said, "You need to see this." He showed me the screen, and I felt my stomach drop. There was a shape, a faint, human-shaped outline, standing right next to us. But when I looked around, there was no one there. Mark decided to do a spirit box session next. It's this device that supposedly lets spirits communicate by manipulating radio frequencies. He turned it on, and the static noise filled the air. "Is there anyone here with us?" Mark asked. At first, it was just static. Then, clear as day, a voice crackled through. "Leave." I swear, I almost passed out. Mark stayed for another hour, trying to gather more evidence, but the vibe in the house kept getting darker. By the time he left, he told me, "Whatever's here doesn't want you here. You might want to consider leaving." Great, just what I wanted to hear. Part 7. The Landlord's Warning. The next day, I called Mr. Hargrove. I tried to sound calm, but my voice was shaking as I told him about the basement, how I'd opened the door, seen the carvings, and heard the growl. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "You opened the basement door?" he finally said, his voice low and tight. "Yes," I admitted. "What's going on, Mr. Hargrove? What is this place?" He sighed heavily, and I could hear the strain in his voice. "I told you not to go down there. That door's locked for a reason." "That's not an answer," I snapped. "I deserve to know what's going on. Is the house haunted? What's behind that little door?" "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking now. "I tried to get rid of it, but it doesn't leave. It's tied to the house." "What's tied to the house?" I demanded. Another pause. Then, he said something that sent chills down my spine. "The family before you, they tried to open it too. That's when things got bad." My stomach turned. "You're saying this thing is dangerous?" "It's more than dangerous," he said. "It feeds on fear. The more scared you are, the stronger it gets. That's why I keep the rent low. People don't stay long anyway. I just need someone here to keep the place quiet." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This man had basically tricked me into being some kind of caretaker for a house he knew was messed up. "Why don't you just sell it?" I asked. He laughed bitterly. "You think anyone would buy it? The house won't let me leave, and now, neither will it let you." That was the moment I realized I was trapped. After he hung up, I felt like my whole world had tilted on its axis. I wanted to pack my bags and run, but where would I go? I couldn't afford to break the lease, and even if I could, something about Mr. Hargrove's words stuck with me. The house won't let you leave. Part 8. The Breaking Point. After my call with Mr. Hargrove, I felt like I was walking on eggshells. Every noise, every shadow, every tiny movement set me on edge. I started keeping all the lights on, sleeping with the TV running, and avoiding the basement like my life depended on it. But the house wasn't done with me. One night, I woke up to a strange sound, a faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe a tree branch scraping against the house. But as I sat up and listened, I realized it was coming from inside the room. I turned on the lamp and froze. The scratching was coming from inside the walls. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, and pressed my ear to the wall. The sound moved, first to one corner, then across the room, like something was crawling behind the plaster. It stopped for a moment, and I held my breath. Then, all at once, the sound exploded into a series of loud bangs, like something was pounding on the wall, trying to get out. I screamed and ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me. As I stood in the hallway, trying to catch my breath, I heard a faint voice coming from the other side of the door. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a laugh. Low, guttural, and absolutely inhuman. That was the breaking point for me. The next morning, I called Hannah and begged her to come over. I told her everything, the noises, the mirror, the basement, and what Mr. Hargrove had said. At first, she thought I was exaggerating, but when she heard the desperation in my voice, she agreed to come over after work. By the time she arrived, I was a nervous wreck. I'd barely eaten, hadn't slept, and felt like the walls were closing in on me. When Hannah walked in, she immediately stopped and frowned. "It feels weird in here," she said, rubbing her arms like she was cold. I nodded. "Now you know why I'm losing it." We sat down in the living room, and I showed her some of the videos Mark had sent me from his investigation. The thermal image of the figure in the hallway, the EMF spikes, and the spirit box recording of the voice telling us to leave. Hannah's face went pale. "Okay, yeah, this is bad. Why haven't you left yet?" I told her about what Mr. Hargrove had said, that the house wouldn't let me leave. "That's ridiculous," she said. "It's just an old house with bad vibes. You can leave any time you want." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Part 9, The House Fights Back. Hannah's confidence gave me a little hope. Maybe she was right. Maybe the house didn't have some supernatural grip on me. Maybe all of this was just in my head, fueled by fear and stress. But then the house decided to remind us who was in charge. We were sitting in the living room, trying to come up with a plan. Should I move out and risk the consequences, or should we try to cleanse the house somehow? That's when it started. First, it was the lights. They flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. "What the hell?" Hannah said, pulling out her phone for a flashlight. Before we could even think about checking the breaker, we heard a loud crash from the kitchen. It sounded like glass shattering. Hannah grabbed my arm. "What was that?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. We stood frozen for a moment, listening. The house was silent, except for the faint creak of floorboards above us. Like someone was walking around upstairs. Hannah whispered, "You said no one else is here, right?" I nodded, feeling my heart race. Then, from the hallway, came the sound of heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. Hannah and I backed up against the couch, clutching each other like scared kids. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room, and for a moment, everything was still. And then the door to the living room slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. Hannah screamed, and I grabbed her hand, dragging her toward the front door. We were both in full panic mode, fumbling with the lock and nearly tripping over each other as we tried to get out. As soon as we stepped outside, the air felt lighter, like a weight had been lifted off my chest. Hannah was shaking, her face pale. "Okay," she said, her voice unsteady. "You weren't kidding. This place is messed up." We got in her car and sat there for a while, trying to process what had just happened. "You can't stay here," Hannah finally said. "I don't care what your landlord said or what it costs to break the lease. You have to leave." I wanted to agree with her, but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind. What if leaving wasn't enough? What if the house, or whatever was inside it, wouldn't let me go that easily? Part 10. The Truth Revealed. That night, I stayed at Hannah's place. We didn't say much, both of us still reeling from the madness we'd just experienced. I knew I couldn't go back to the house, not yet. But as much as I wanted to escape, a part of me knew I couldn't leave without finding out the truth. The next day, I called Mr. Hargrove again. This time, I wasn't going to be polite. I needed answers. Real answers. When he picked up, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "What's going on in this house? Why are you acting like it's some kind of prison? What's really in that basement?" There was silence on the other end for a moment before he spoke. "I told you not to go down there." "You've told me nothing," I snapped. "I want the truth. Who was the family that lived here before me? What happened to them?" He sighed heavily. "They were the last ones. The boy went missing. But that wasn't the worst of it. His mother, she was different. She started seeing things, hearing voices. It drove her mad. She tried to destroy the house, to burn it down, but it wouldn't let her. And when she died, I had to seal it off. I tried everything I could to keep it contained. The thing in the basement, it's not a spirit. It's not even human. It's something else." I felt cold all over. "Something else? What do you mean?" "It's a thing that feeds on fear," he said quietly. "It's been here for as long as anyone can remember. It can take many forms, visions, voices, physical manifestations. But the worst part is that it has a way of drawing people in, making them think it's harmless. And once you're hooked, it doesn't let go. It's not about the house. It's about you. I felt like the ground had just been ripped out from under me. "So what? Am I just stuck here?" I asked, my voice shaking. "No," he replied. "But you need to leave. If you don't, it'll only get worse. It's already feeding off you, the fear you've built up. If you don't confront it, you'll be trapped forever." "Confront it?" I repeated, disbelief in my voice. "How? How do I confront something like that?" He paused before answering. "You have to go into the basement. You have to face whatever's down there. It's the only way to stop it. You have to take away its power." The words hung in the air for a long time. I couldn't even process it. How could I confront something that wasn't even human? How could I take away its power when I felt so helpless? But then, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the exhaustion of living in fear for so long, or maybe it was the realization that staying in this constant state of terror was slowly destroying me. But I knew what I had to do. I told Mr. Hargrove I'd do it. Later that night, I drove back to the house, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I fought to keep myself calm. By the time I reached the front door, I was shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the lock. When I stepped inside, the air felt thick, oppressive. The house seemed to be waiting for me, like it knew what I was about to do. I walked straight to the basement door, my heart hammering in my chest. The strange symbols still covered the wood, and the air around it felt freezing cold. But this time, instead of fear, I felt a strange sense of determination. I unlocked the door and stepped into the darkness. I'm not sure how long I stood there, staring into the black void of the basement, but something inside me told me I had to move forward. So, I did. I walked down the stairs, feeling the cold air settle around me like a physical weight. When I reached the bottom, I didn't hesitate. I walked straight toward the small door with the symbols, my flashlight shining on the latch. And then, for the first time, I wasn't scared. I reached out, grabbed the latch, and yanked it open. The moment I did, everything went silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and the temperature in the room returned to normal. What was behind the door? Nothing. There was nothing there. Just an empty room. The fear I'd been carrying for months evaporated in an instant. And that's when I realized the house wasn't alive. It wasn't some monster that was feeding off me. It was just a house. A house filled with old memories, broken dreams, and a family who had suffered. And in its history, it had left a mark, a scar. But that scar was only as powerful as I allowed it to be. The house didn't have power over me. I was the one who had given it power. I left the basement, locked the door behind me, and walked out of that house for good. I didn't look back. Looking back, I realize how much fear can shape your reality. The house wasn't haunted by anything supernatural. It was haunted by my own fear, my own doubts, and my own uncertainty. But once I confronted it head on, I took back control. If you're dealing with something that scares you, whether it's a situation, a place, or even your own thoughts, remember this. Fear only has power if you give it that power. So, if you're struggling with something right now, don't let it control you. Face it. Confront it. And you'll find that it's not as powerful as it seems. If you've ever been through something similar, leave a comment below. Let's talk about it. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life mysteries and experiences. Stay strong and remember, fear can be defeated.